While browsing through a Seattle airport bookstore a few weeks ago, I saw a quartet of books written by English author Malcolm Gladwell, 3 of which I had already read: The Tipping Point, David and Goliath, and The Outliers, and the one I hadn't read, Blink. So I picked Blink up and started reading it on the way home in the plane. Now, although the books are different in some respects, they are similar streams of thought that run throughout all of them. One of those streams is conditioning yourself for the right moment, or preparing yourself enough so that when the time comes, you are ready to respond. Similar to when the starting quarterback, for instance, is injured, the backup will have to have practiced enough and will understand the offense sufficiently enough to step in and play. In Gladwell's Outliers, a book he uses, in this book, he uses what is referred to as the 10,000 hour rule, which I had mentioned before. The thesis suggests, in simple terms, that the more you practice, the more you rehearse, the better you will become at your art or at your sport or in your field of interest. 2 of the examples he uses of preparedness are the Beatles and Bill Gates. When the Beatles, Gladwell claims, beginning in 1960, the English group was invited to Hamburg, Germany, to play at a nightclub there. Between 1960 and 1962, they played 270 nights in just 1.5 years in Hamburg. They also performed live an estimated 1,200 times before they arrived in the United States in 1964. Gladwell said that most bands don't play 1,200 times in their entire career. The Hamburg Crucible is one of the things that set the Beatles apart. Take Bill Gates as another example. Way back in 1968, he was fortunate to have had his private secondary school in Seattle invest $300,000 in computer equipment, which was unheard of at the time. Gates spent hours and hours in the computer lab at his school. He said he was obsessed with the computer. Then he figured out how to get free computer time at the University of Washington. He'd go up there between 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning and sneak in when nothing else was scheduled. Hours and hours and hours on the computer, the 10,000 hour rule. Gates' mother said, "We always wonder why it was so hard to get him up in the morning to go to school." When it came time, you see, the Beatles were ready for the music revolution. When it came time, Bill Gates was ready for the computer revolution, because they both practiced, because they both were unwittingly examples of what can happen if you put in 10,000 hours. Both the Beatles and Bill Gates were preconditioned for success. It just didn't happen magically. Let's take this lesson and apply it to faith. When you say you have faith in someone or something, it's usually preconditioned by some experience or experiences you've had with that person or you've had with that thing. When you board a plane, for instance, you have every reason to believe that you're going to get there safely from point A to point B without any incident, because you believe, you have faith in the safety of the systems, the proper training of pilots, certified airplane mechanics, well-trained, government-approved air traffic controllers. You trust the systems that allow the plane to taxi and safely take off. You've been preconditioned to trust and have faith in that industry. Or in your relationship with another person, if that person over the years has consistently demonstrated trustworthiness, has followed through on his or her commitments, has spoken truthfully about matters, keeps his word when he says or she says he or she is going to do something, chances are significantly high that you will have faith in that person. You have been preconditioned, you see, to have faith. Even in parenting, if the parent consistently shows unconditional love for the child, no strings attached, and follows these principles: I love you because you are my child, and no matter what happens to you or no matter what you do, I will still love you. And finally, whatever you need, I'll always be there for you. With the practice of these parental principles, the child will grow up trusting in the love of that parent and will feel secure forever in that same love. You see, he or she has been preconditioned to trust and to have faith. And so we know that faith in parents and friends and relatives and others is really preconditioned. Now, faith in the spiritual realm requires preconditioning too. As a matter of fact, the 10,000 hour rule is not irrelevant to the quality of one's faith. There are two verses in our lesson from Luke, read by Margot this morning, that are particularly relevant to this preconditioned faith. The first one is Peter's response to Jesus, telling him and the rest of the fishermen to go out into the deep water and to lower your nets for a catch after they finished working day and night and had caught nothing. And Peter said anyway to Jesus, "Because you say so, I will let down my nets." This required faith on Peter's part to go through the whole drill again without any guarantee of catching anything. The second one is at the end of the passage this morning, when the fishermen, after responding to Jesus' challenge to go out again and then make this huge catch of fish, enough that their nets were breaking and their boats were falling apart, they pull their boats ashore, leave everything behind, and follow Jesus. That's it. They're gone. No more fishing. No more community of family and friends. No more security of familiar soundings. The only thing that was certain was uncertainty. The only thing predictable was unpredictability. As a matter of fact, Jesus would tell them later on, "I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. Therefore, be shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves. Be on your guard, because you will be handed over to local councils, you will be flogged in the synagogues, and on my account you will be brought before governors and kings. But when they arrest you, do not worry about what you're going to say. At that time, I will give you what to say." Now, on the surface, this is a romantic story, isn't it? These fishermen casting their nets aside and leaving behind their handcrafted boats to follow the promised Messiah. The story makes for good reading. It makes for good children's stories. It makes for the stuff of romantic idealism that most of us would like to hold on to the rest of our lives, until you read later in the scriptures about the ridicule and the persecution and the torture and finally death that the disciples endured at the hands of their enemies, as Jesus predicted they would. But the important thing to remember about this story is the disciples' courageous response. And you know, it probably didn't happen in a vacuum. They were more than likely preconditioned to expect the Messiah. They were more than likely schooled in the fundamentals of their religion. They were more than likely trained to take chances and to accept risk. You see, the life of a Galilean fisherman was anything but a Sunday picnic or a walk in the park. It was a tough life. And they were dependent on the number of fish they harvested that day. Palestinian fishermen caught fish to eat or to sell. It was simply a matter of life and death for them. So when it came to life and death issues with the Messiah, perhaps the 10,000 rule applied to them. Enough training in the home, enough training in the synagogue, enough training in the school of hard knocks, enough training in the principles of courage and living on the edge daily. So when the call came from the Messiah, Peter, Andrew, John, and the rest were ready. They were preconditioned enough in faith to respond. Reflecting back to the Old Testament, as I mentioned in the prior sermon, Malcolm Gladwell in his book, David and Goliath, writes about David's epic battle, of course, against Goliath, with the Philistines setting up camp along the southern edge of Elah, and the Israelites along the northern ridge. The two armies looking across the ravine at each other, staring each other down. Again, this story has all the romantic trimmings. A young shepherd boy going up against an intimidating, bully-like giant with experienced Israelite soldiers running the opposite direction. David says to King Saul that he is the one that can take on Goliath. Saul, of course, quickly dismisses the idea as wishful thinking from a young kid who has no idea what he's up against. But David pleaded his case with Saul, and this is the key when it comes to David's preconditioning of courage and faith. He says, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or bear came and carried off the sheep, I went after it. I struck it, and I rescued the sheep from the mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by the hair, and I struck it, and I killed it. Your servant, Saul, has killed both the lion and the bear. This Philistine, Goliath, will be like one of them." Very convincing. Now, it should be said that even though David overcame incredible odds to defeat Goliath, the fact of the matter was that he was ready. He was ready by the courage that came from fending off lions and bears. He was ready with the skill that he acquired as a marksman with a slingshot. And most importantly, he was ready because he had faith. One of the greatest lines in Scripture, I think, is David's words to Goliath. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord God Almighty." Nothing better than that. The intangibles of faith. The young David that had been preconditioned, you see, in the wilderness, protecting the flocks, learning all those fundamentals in the synagogue of what it meant to be loyal to God and not just oneself. Again, faith and courage don't happen in a vacuum. It comes with preparation. So when the moment comes to prove your faith, you are ready. Just a few days ago, shortly after Martin Luther King Day, my daughter, who appreciates Dr. King's legacy, as I do myself, of course, sent me one of her favorite Martin Luther King quotes, which included the urging of the church to be less of a thermometer, according to Dr. King, that recorded the ideals and principles of popular opinion, and more of a thermostat that transforms the mores of society. He also said in the quote that he, Dr. King, was a son, he was a grandson, and he was a great-grandson of preachers. Dr. King had a rich history in the church. He studied the Bible inside and out. He read the great theologians. He knew history and philosophy. All of this prepared him, you see, to organize the Selma and Montgomery marches, the March on Washington when he delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, and finally to put himself in the sights of an assassin's rifle scope. But you see, Dr. King's passion and commitment, again, did not happen in a vacuum. It could have very well been the 10,000-hour rule, you see. All the hours he studied, all the hours he observed the ministers that had gone before him and his family, all the hours he prayed for God to give him the strength to do what he needed to do, his faith was preconditioned enough to make an enormous impact on the country. Question for all of us is, will we be ready when the time comes? And it will come at some point, and it probably has already come, to stand up for our faith. Will we be ready when the time comes to make a significant response to a real significant need? Will we be ready to demonstrate the example of Christ? Will our faith be preconditioned enough to meet the challenges head on? You know, if you spend the hours here in this sanctuary, as you are doing this morning, the hours and hours and hours in the sanctuary over the years and years and years, if you spend the hours and hours and the years reading and understanding the Bible, and if you spend the hours and hours and the years reading great books, and if you spend the hours and hours and the years reaching out to others, you put in probably 10,000 hours. And it's likely that you'll be ready when the time comes.